Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Our Lady of Pompeii Parish. My name is Sister Joyce, and I'm Pastoral Associate here at Our Lady of Pompeii. It's my privilege to tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening. Alan Nowicki is the Director of Programming at the National Historic Landmark Roycroft Campus. He has been a teacher for more than 25 years, having taught at every grade level from pre-K through college, specializing in art and history. Alan is a regular speaker at local schools, libraries, churches, and historical sites around Western New York. His recent presentations have included talks at the Buffalo History Museum, Iowa State University, the Folger Shakespeare Conference, and the Smithsonian. On a personal note, we're proud to mention that Alan is the son of Richard and Jerry Nowicki, who are parishioners here at Our Lady of Pompeii. Tonight, Alan will speak to us on searching for God through art. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Alan Nowicki.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. So as Sister Joyce mentioned, I have been teaching for over 27 years now. Unfortunately, I don't get a chance to teach the young kids very much anymore, which is a little bit of a disappointment. If you're having a bad day, my suggestion is to go and experience the creative chaos that is a kindergarten art class. And whenever you're having a bad day, this suddenly just brings joy into your life. And even though it's been more than 20 years, I still remember one day in particular. For those who know me, I love to ask questions. And I had a kindergarten group. In fact, I don't even remember what project we were working on. But the class was over and had all the kids lined up at the door waiting for the teacher to show up, and the teacher was running a little late, so I started asking the students some questions. And I said, well, what's your favorite artwork? And little Amber said, well, actually the one I just made. Okay. I asked Patrice, and she said, the Moaning Lisa. And little Yasakari said, the 16 Chapels. And of course, I asked, well, which one of the 16 chapels do you like the most? And without a beat, he said, well, they're all pretty good. Now, since I don't have the little kids as much, I teach college classes more. And in fact, I have another one starting up next Tuesday. And usually on that very, very first day of class, I always ask them the same question, because since it is an art history class, we have to figure out what we're actually talking about. And we have to hope, oh, good, the technology is working. So the question I always ask them is, well, what is art? And it seems like a rather simple question until you actually start thinking about it a little bit more. And it's kind of hard to come up with a specific definition for it. So I'll ask you, so what is art? Well, whatever you think it is. Oh, okay. Well, that could lead us down a rabbit hole there. So I usually ask, and I get that question a lot, that answer a lot. It's whatever you think it is. It's in the eye of the beholder. And I said, well, I'm going to need some criteria for this class a little bit. So I start asking them, what would the criteria be for art? And I usually throw up a picture and an on-air up Patrice. I'm going to throw up the Moaning Lisa. Would we all agree that this is art? And why do we know that this is art? Because since you were in kindergarten, somebody told you that this was art. Okay. Well, how do we know it's even there? Well, I guess the first criteria for this would be we use our senses. So we need to use our senses in order to know that there's art. And depending on what kind of art form it is, music, dance, film, we might use different senses. Well, why else? Was it there all the time? No. At some point, somebody had to create it or make it. Okay? So far, we're good? How about, I get this a lot, expresses a feeling, an emotion, an idea. Are we okay with that? Sure. And then the last one is, well, it contains the elements of art. So these are kind of like the ingredients of the recipe you would use to make art. Now, in the visual arts, you'll have line, shape, form, color, texture, space. In other arts, music, you might have dynamics and key signature and beats and rhythms, things like that. In dance, you might have something different. In film, you'll have editing, you'll have camera shots. So different art forms have different elements. Now, depending how an artist uses these elements, has one thing look different than another. That's why we get different kinds of art, or different ways that things look. So then my question becomes, is this art? Does it have all of those criteria? Well, we're using our senses. It was made. It has all the elements of art in it. Now notice I didn't ask the question, is it good art or bad art? Because again, depending on the eye of the beholder, there's grandmothers around the country that have these on their refrigerators right now, and they think that this is absolutely beautiful. How about this? Is this art? So let's see if it goes through our criteria. So do we use our senses? Yes. Was it created? Yes. Does it use the elements of art? Yes. So I guess this should be considered art, right? I would say yes, it does. In fact, there are places around the world that don't even have a word for art because they just look at everything as having beauty and having been created, which I kind of find very interesting, that that's just your perspective, to look at everything as if it is art. Now, in my class, I can't necessarily suddenly be looking at everything. So I always have to tell the students, well, our next criteria is the fact that we're looking at things that are human-made. Now, that's not saying that things that are made in other ways. If you go to the Buffalo Zoo, sometimes they put a paintbrush in the elephant's tusk and he paints a painting. Is that art? It is, but I'm not going to look at that. Now, so if we're talking about the question of good art or bad art, well, now we have to talk about something else. So one of the best ways that I can talk about good art and bad art, or maybe the difference between God art and human art, is through two words. These are two words that I learned in high school, so I have to be careful here. Now, I grew up in the 80s, and one of these words that I learned was awesome. Everything was awesome, unless if it was really, really good, then it was totally awesome. But in this case, I am sorry to say that my generation kind of stole this word and completely changed it to mean something else. But if you think about what the word awesome means, extremely impressive or daunting, inspiring great admiration, breathtaking, awe-inspiring, or stunning. That is how I view really, really good art. So if I go into a museum, there might be an artwork on the other side of the room. I walk in and I'm like, oh, and I'm filled with awe. It is awesome. Now, the other word I remember from high school, the only word I remember from my vocabulary class in 10th grade English, and that was ineffable. Does anybody know what this word means? And I think the only reason why I remember this word is because I think there was a girl sitting next to me in class that I'm like, oh, this is the definition of her. Too great or extreme to be expressed or described in words, indescribable. That is how I view God art. Having something that is so beautiful, it is almost impossible to describe. And if we go back to those pictures of like the Grand Canyon, if anybody has been to the Grand Canyon, I'm afraid I have not been yet, but I hope to get there. But I have been up in the Swiss Alps. And I know when I was up in the Swiss Alps, no picture will do it justice. You look at this and you're just, it's impossible to describe it without actually being there. You see some sunsets and you look at these sunsets and you're like, it's impossible to describe this sunset to anyone. Even these pictures don't do it justice. So, God art, ineffable, beyond description. So if I was to, this wonderful, a picture of a sunset I took from Lake Erie, absolutely beautiful. It was even more beautiful in real life. It was ineffable. Now, if I was to take a time machine, go back into time, scoop up 20 or 25 of the greatest artists who have ever lived, bring them back to the beach and say, everybody paint a picture of this sunset. So we have Picasso and Da Vinci and Raphael and Rubens and O'Keeffe and Degas and Monet, all painting these pictures of this sunset. First of all, none of the paintings will look the same, correct? They will probably all be awesome, but they'll never compare to the actual sunset. So in many ways, what great art is doing is it's trying to capture a small little essence of what God is. It can never complete and completely cover the whole entire essence of what God has created, but it's just trying to give you a small little glimpse of that. And that's how I think of ineffable art and awesome art that people try to create. Now, this could be subconsciously. An artist could be trying to do this, or God can work in many ways and even work through an artist who is an atheist. But I still think he's working through them to give you a glimpse of who or what he is. And one of the main purposes of people always have, well, should we really have art in school? Well, coming from an art teacher, I think that's the only subject we should teach in school, but that's beside the point. But I think it's the only subject that you can truly teach critical thinking in many ways, as well as one of the important aspects of an art class is to teach you how to see. What I mean by that is, if you ever take it, I'll probably ask this group here saying, who thinks they can draw? A lot of people are like, I never learned how to draw. I can't draw. I can't do it. And my question to you is, I bet I could teach 99% of you to draw. Because what I'm really going to teach you is how to see. Starting off in a drawing class, the first thing I like to do is I always ask the students, this would be a college class, I'd say, I want you to draw a self-portrait of yourself. And they immediately look down on their paper and they start to draw. They never looked at themselves once. They're just going from what they think they look like as they're drawing. If you ever look at an artist, 90% of the time they will be looking up at the object and not looking at the paper, because they are looking at the object and not trying to draw the object. So the majority of the time is learning how to see. So what I want to do for the rest of the evening, I chose 4 artworks that I wanted to look at. And I want to talk about, well, what does this tell us about God? What does this tell us about us as people? Maybe give you a little art history lesson along the way. These 4 artworks I chose, they're all from different centuries. And they're all different medium. So I have a sculpture, I have a painting, I have a film, and I have a piece of ceramics. So that's what I'm going with. And let's see how we can do here. So my first artwork I want to look at is a sculpture. And I might as well go with a piece that you probably all have seen before by what I consider is the greatest artist who ever lived. And the more I study artists, the more I keep on thinking that he's the one, he's the man. So this is Michelangelo. Now Michelangelo was considered somewhat of a prodigy early on in life. Every time his father sent him to school, and he kept on running away to school and running off to draw somewhere else. So there finally he said, okay. Well, he seemed to have lots of skills with that, and eventually Lorenzo de' Medici ended up taking him under the wing and bringing him into the school that the Medicis were running in Florence. And the first artwork that we have of Michelangelo is this black screen. Oh, here we go. This piece right here called the Madonna of the Stairs. He did this artwork when he was 15 years old. Pretty impressive. Now, even Michelangelo believed that his artistic talents were actually a special gift from God, and that he was chosen as an instrument to fulfill the divine will. Now with that, he also was very worried that his desire for creating beauty was going to distract him from the pursuits of a personal holiness. So he often battled with that throughout his life. He was concerned about making the danger of making beauty an idol as opposed to showing the beauty of God. But he got quite a reputation very early on in his life until in 1497, at the age of 22, he was commissioned by a French cardinal, who was the French ambassador for Rome, to create a sculpture for the French cardinal's tomb. And he started it his next year at the age of 23, and he finished it 1 year later, and that is this sculpture, the Pietà. Raise your hand if you've seen this work before. Okay, very good. So for those who don't know, a Pietà is Italian for pity or sorrow. And it actually was a very popular artwork in the 13th century when the Black Plague was ravishing Europe. And this became a very popular subject to portray, with the idea of the sorrows that all of Europe were kind of going through was similar to the sorrow that Christ had gone through. Once it was finished, everyone who saw it realized that it was an absolute masterpiece and decided not to actually put it on the French cardinal's tomb, but put it at the entranceway to St. Peter's, and that is where it is to this day. But it's set up in a typical Renaissance composition, a very triangular composition, very wide at the base and kind of goes up to a point up at the top with Mary's head. And Michelangelo was a master at details. He knew the human anatomy so well. People to this day still study the fact that he got like the veins right, where if an arm was up and an arm was down, he actually did the veins differently because there'd be more blood flowing through the ones that were down than the ones that were up. I mean, just amazing at his skill. And yet, you probably haven't realized before, but there's something off about this artwork. I want you to look at the proportions of the figures in this piece. If Mary was to stand up, how tall would she be? She would be a giant as compared to Christ, which then makes you wonder, well, why did Michelangelo do it that way? Well, what he wanted to represent is the fact that this was a mother holding her dead child. And he wanted to represent the idea that there are so many artworks of Madonna enthroned, with Madonna holding the baby Jesus, where he was almost representing that again, but in this Pietà, where Mary is holding her baby, her dead baby. And if we get a little bit closer at some of the details of this, I want you to look at Mary's hands, because it's very interesting of what he does with her hands as well. So her right hand that's underneath Christ is just clutching in so close, almost drawing the body into her. And to be able to do this out of marble is absolutely stunning. I did one marble sculpture my entire life. I will never do another one. My arm was so sore hammering away, and little pieces of dust were flying off. So to see this makes me appreciate this even more. But this is Mary's right hand, and then if you look at her left hand, she has it out almost as if she is offering up her child to you. So in one way, she's clutching Christ in as close as she can, and in the other hand, she is offering him to you. Also, if we look at Mary's face, this does not look like a female who has a 33-year-old son. She looks very, very young. And Michelangelo does this on purpose as well. He writes, "The mother had to be young, younger than the son, to prove herself eternally virgin, while the son, incorporated into our human nature, had to appear like any other man in his mortal remains." I want you to look at another detail here on Mary, and that is the strap that is kind of going across her chest. So again, I mentioned that this was considered a masterpiece when it was done, and people were literally coming from around Italy to come and see this sculpture. And Michelangelo would actually stand on the other side of the church and listen to what kind of comments that people were saying about the sculpture. And a group of men came and started talking about how this was one of the most beautiful sculptures that had ever been done, and they're so happy that it was done by one of their great sculptors from Milan. Michelangelo heard this, and he did not like the fact that they said this was done by somebody else. So that night, Michelangelo snuck into the church with his hammer and chisel, and he had a brim hat that he would wear, that he would put candles on it so he could work at night. And he snuck in, and with his hammer and chisel, he wrote on the sash that went across Mary's chest. And what he wrote is, "Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this." The next couple days, he kept on going back to hear what kind of comments he was getting, and he started feeling a sense of shame, that his pride had taken over. This sculpture wasn't about Michelangelo. The sculpture was supposed to be about Christ. And now, right in the middle of the sculpture, here he has this message saying that he's the one who made this. He was so ashamed about this that he will never sign another piece of art for the rest of his life. Because it wasn't about him, it was about God. Now, Michelangelo would end up living nearly 89 years, which is almost double the lifespan of somebody around that time period. He witnessed the pontification of 13 popes and worked for 9 of them. He was a painter, he was a sculptor, he was an architect, questionably doing the most important works of each of those fields. The David for sculpture, the Sistine Chapel, or the 16 chapels, depending on if you're talking the Yassakari. St. Peter's, he helped design and build St. Peter's. And he was a poet as well, doing quite a few poets. When he was, I should say one more thing about this sculpture too. In May of 1972, a man came into St. Peter's with a hammer and made 15 blows to this sculpture. It removed Mary's arm at the elbow. It knocked off a chunk off of her nose, chipped one of her eyelids. Onlookers who were in the church at the time were horrified and remembered scrambling around and picking up the pieces and taking them home. So this was reconstructed. Actually, a block of the marble was removed from Mary's back and used to reconstruct the sculpture, so it does, look the way Michelangelo had intended it to. But when Michelangelo was in his 70s, he had already lived 20 years longer than he thought he would. He decided he was going to start working on a sculpture for his tomb. And he started working on this sculpture right here, which is oftentimes called the Florentine Pietà from 1555. He was never happy with it. He worked on it for almost 8 years until he finally just gave up, and it was never completed. And you can see parts of it look rather finished, and other parts not so much. But to give you an idea of how he felt about this, instead of writing across the sculpture that Michelangelo made this, instead, the figure that is above Christ, which is supposed to be Joseph of Arimathea, Michelangelo carved a self-portrait of himself. So here's Michelangelo now holding up the Christ that he had so graciously worshipped his entire life. Oh, and the bell's tolled perfectly. Our second work is going to be a painting. Now, I know a couple people out there know that I'm somewhat of a movie buff, and this is a scene from one of the classic foreign films, The Seventh Seal, from Ingmar Bergman from 1957, a Swedish film. And it's a rather interesting film just because in the film, a knight comes back from the Crusades and he ends up playing a game of chess with death. And the whole movie is talking about his life and trying to see if he lived a worthy life as opposed to taking on this game against death. And I always wonder, well, where do some of these artists get some of these wonderful ideas for this? And not that long ago, I found a painting, and this is that painting. It's called The Chess Player. I could ask you, well, what do you actually see in this painting? Well, first of all, raise your hand if you've ever seen this painting before. Okay. So if you look at this painting, well, what do we see? So we have two figures that seem to be playing a game of chess. And I should just also tell you quickly about chess, because I realize a lot of people don't play chess as much as they used to. So the game of chess, two people play against each other. They have two different sides. They have a variety of 16 pieces. Each of the there's different pieces. There's a king, a queen, a rook, a bishop, a knight, and pawns. They each move in different directions. You capture your opponent's piece if you land on their space. And the way you win the game is if you capture the other opponent's king. That is how you win. So this is two men playing chess. Now, One of them looks rather cocky, confident. The one with the helmet with the red feather on there. The other one looks like he's in a little bit more stress. There seems to be an angel in the center watching over, and she doesn't look like she's too hopeful for the one man. Looks like there's quite a lot of black pieces still on the board. There looks like there's quite a lot of white pieces off the board, which then makes you wonder, well, it doesn't look like things are going well for him. Now, some more elements to this piece is, first of all, the man in the green is sitting on a chair that has a lion next to it, and that lion has its claws on a skull. You have these two dragons or gargoyles kind of coming down the back columns. This does not look very pleasant. Even to the point of, if you look a little bit closer, the table that the chessboard is on almost looks like it might be a casket. And so we have this idea that this man is playing chess against the devil. So the setting is very foreboding, and you kind of wonder, well, what is the whole meaning behind this? So let's talk a little bit about the artist. Artist most people probably have never heard of, Friedrich Moritz August Retzich. So he was born in Germany in 1779. He was a painter, a draughtsman, an etcher. He joined the Dresden Academy of Fine Arts and became a professor there. And like many of the artists of his generation, he was very interested in a popular play that had just come out called Faust by Goethe, published in 1808. And this is all about Satan betting God that Faust, a man who was trying to learn all that he could possibly learn, could be lured away from a righteous and honorable path. And Retzich was commissioned to create 26 engravings for a publication of Faust in 1818. And this pretty much made him financially set for the rest of his life. It was reprinted multiple times. And nobody quite knows when the first edition of this painting was actually sketched. But we do know that the first print was published in 1831. And it bears the same title as this painting, called The Chess Players. And for that reason, we kind of date the first painting of this as 1831. Now, this became an extremely popular painting in the late 19th century. So popular that there are so many versions of this painting out there. It's everything from etchings to drawings to paintings to more paintings to more paintings. Unless you want to get really elaborate, and then you get fancy frames. You could have maybe some clocks put into it, and then some three-dimensional repoussé relief sculptures as well. So this was an extremely popular piece that just everyone might have a copy of this in their house. And with that, it started having a different title placed on it called The Game of Life, which is also rather interesting. And the chess pieces have kind of talk about the struggle of life itself. If we get up a little bit closer in, I think I even got one more closer. Unfortunately, that isn't a really clear image, but Retzich starts talking about the symbolism that he used in these chess pieces. So the farthest black piece on the left, the tall piece, is actually Satan's king, and it is himself, wearing the exact same clothes, the hat with the feather on it that he is wearing. The queen is seen as pleasure, a voluptuous female figure with an unveiled bosom. His castle is laziness. His second castle is anger. His first bishop is pride. His second bishop is falsehood. And I can go into all the symbolisms for all of these, but I don't really have the time. The first king is greed. The second king is unbelief. And his 8 pawns are all considered doubt. And it's also interesting, you see this little spider there at the bottom of the table that talks about this, the web that Satan likes to snare all of us in. Now, the young man's king is his soul, with wings of a butterfly on his shoulders. His queen is seen as religion, stretching out one hand as if giving protection. His first castle is hope. His second castle is truth. His first bishop is peace with a palm. His second bishop is humility. His first knight is innocence. His second knight is love. And his pawns are seen as worship and prayer. And as one commentator wrote, Satan has already taken from the young man several angels' heads. Love and innocence are lost. Humility is gone, and peace, just seized, is still held in the claw-like fingers of Satan. The young man has vanquished only anger and overcome a single doubt from Satan. Although it was never officially given this title, this artwork will soon become known as checkmate. And again, for those who don't know about chess, checkmate is the move that the king is captured and there's no way out. Now, with this story, I want to bring somebody else into this, and that is Paul Morphy. Paul Morphy was considered one of the greatest chess players of all time. He ushered in the modern ideas of what chess is today. Born in 1837, he was called a chess prodigy at a very young age. At 12, he checkmated the French chess master and beat the second ranked US player in 17 moves. Pretty good. He traveled around the world playing the strongest players, even multiple matches at the same time. In 1859, he was even received an invitation to play chess with Queen Victoria. And surprisingly enough, she won. I don't know if that is a surprise or not. In the autumn of 1861, on a trip to Richmond, Virginia, Morphy was invited to the home of an Honorable Reverend R.R. Harrison. There was a large dinner party held at the Reverend's house, and the Reverend just happened to have a copy of this painting on the wall, in which Morphy had never seen before. And he was fascinated by it, obviously. And he kept on walking by it and walking by it, and finally, after the dinner was over, he walked by it once more and he stared at it and he asked the Reverend, "What's the title of this painting again?" And the Reverend said, "Checkmate." And he said, "I think the title's wrong." He said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "The king still has another move. I think I can take the young man's game." Now, with the Reverend being a rather accomplished chess player himself, he decided to say, "Not even you, Mr. Morphy, can win this game." In which Mr. Morphy said, "Challenge accepted." The table was moved aside, a small table was set up with a chessboard, and they set it up the exact same way that the board was set up in the painting. And sure enough, within a few moves, Morphy won the game. Now, the guests around the party were also rather surprised that the victory was snatched from the devil, from this young man saved. And since the painting was so popular at the time, the story spread rather quickly, and everybody started telling, or traveled around the country, that Mr. Murphy had beat the devil. No one could believe it. Articles started appearing in national chess magazines. Yes, there was such a thing back then. And they even put together the board and asked other people to try to win the game. And nobody could do it. After Morphy's death in 1884, chess players continued to debate if this was actually a winnable game, and people started believing that this was just a tall tale. The Reverend Harrison and many of the guests at that dinner party continued to insist that yes, Mr. Murphy won the game, and the only clue Murphy ever gave was the statement, "The king still has another move." Now, what's interesting enough about that is if you think about this, the Bible is filled with checkmates. You have Joseph being sold off to slavery by his brothers. You have Moses and the Israelites cornered at the Red Sea with the Egyptian army closing in. You have Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. You have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the furnace. You have Jonah being thrown into the whale. And maybe, the greatest is the fact that a dead Christ is being placed in the tomb. And each one of these times, Satan said, checkmate. And each one of these times, the king had another move. On a side note, so this painting was actually sold at Christie's in 1999 for $82,000, and unfortunately now is in a private collection. So you can't see this, but like I said, there are so many variations of this. It is quite amazing. How am I doing on time here? Okay, I'm doing good. Okay, so the next one I'm going to do, so this is my film I want to talk about. And the title of this is The Greatest Baseball Player and the Worst Baseball Player. So, in the 1960s, this man, Lee Mendelson, was a documentary filmmaker from San Francisco, and he had just completed a documentary called A Man Named Mays, all about Willie Mays. Mendelson loved baseball. He thought that this would be a perfect film to do, and it actually was pretty successful. So he was deciding on what he wanted to have his next documentary on. And there was another man living in the Bay Area who had an ongoing story around the worst baseball player. And he thought, well, this would be rather interesting if I follow up my Willie Mays documentary on a bad baseball player. And so he contacted this man. His name was in the phone book. His friends all called him Sparky. So he started talking to Sparky. And here is Sparky sitting next to Mendelson. And they put together a half-an-hour documentary on the worst baseball player. They decided to do some music to it. Mendelson decided to get a fellow San Francisco musician, Vince Guaraldi, to do some music for this piece as well. He had just had a hit called Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And he thought, well, this is perfect. And they started shopping the documentary around. 2 years went by, and there were no takers. No one was interested. Until April of 1965, when Sparky's Man of the Worst Baseball Player just happened to appear on the April cover of Time magazine. Yes, Sparky is Charles Schultz, and the worst baseball player is Charlie Brown. Now, once it had appeared on Time magazine, well, now people started taking notice, and they started to revisit that documentary on the worst baseball player. So a few weeks later, after this cover appeared, a call came from an ad agency in New York, and they said they liked the documentary, but they were wondering if instead of having that documentary, if they would do another one as a Christmas special. And Mendelssohn called up Charles Schulz and said, well, I got good news and I got bad news for you. He said, the good news is one of the clients, Coca-Cola, would like our documentary. He said the bad news is that they were wondering about it to be the Charlie Brown Christmas special, in which Charles Schulz said, well, what show might that be? And he said, the one you need to make an outline for and mail out to me by tomorrow. And he said, okay, come on up. Now, so they had called on a Wednesday and they needed the outline for this special on Monday in Atlanta. Now, again, this is pre-email and this is going to take some time. So over the next 24 hours, Mendelssohn and Schulz came up with the outline for a Christmas special. And Schulz had 5 different ideas and requests that he said had to be in this special. He insisted on it, or he wouldn't go ahead with it. Number 1 is there would be outdoor winter scenes, skating, and a school play. He had just envisioned that this was, and growing up in Minnesota, this was probably the things he remembered about wintertime. Number 2, there would be a no laugh track. Now, this was unheard of at that time. Every show had a laugh track. But Charles Schulz thought that the audience should enjoy the show at his own pace. Ironically, CBS made a version with a laugh track in case Schulz ever decided to change his mind. He never did. Number 3, children would be used for the voice acting. Again, something that had never been done before. Well, we don't know what kind of professionalism we're going to get from kids. He said, I don't care. I want the kids talking. Okay? The music would be a combination of classical, traditional hymns, and jazz music. Well, that's rather odd, especially because jazz was still pretty new at that time, and it was considered, not the best of music. And number 5, an explanation of the true meaning of Christmas was going to be put in the show. So they sent it off, and for 3 weeks they didn't hear anything back. Finally, in June, they heard from the agency, and once again they said, we have good news and we have bad news. The good news is Coca-Cola wants to move ahead with our special. The bad news is they want it by early December of this year. So that's less than 6 months. So they called Bill Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn is Lee. Bill Melendez, who was an animator for Warner Brothers and had worked with Schulz in the past for a commercial. He had never been in charge of a full half-an-hour show before. So they had to create 12 drawings for every second, which would be over 13,000 drawings in total. So that is approximately 200 drawings a day that they had to put together for this special to have it done in time. Mendelssohn really liked the music that Vince Guaraldi had done for his original documentary and decided to call him back. And within a couple days, Guaraldi had called him on the phone and said, I have this song going through my head. I want to come over and play it for you. He's like, I don't have time. I'm doing drawings. He said, well, can I just play it over the phone? And he started out with the do, 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 do. Says, I love it. Let's put it in the show. And so the theme for Linus and Lucy are made. Some of the early drawings for the special. Now, Schulz was rather adamant by the fact that Linus was going to read from the Bible. Mendelssohn and Melendez was concerned that the religious might be a controversial topic, especially on television. And Schulz, I love this picture. So the kids working on the voice. I think I had that shirt. And Schultz commented, well, if we don't do this, who else will? Which I think is rather appropriate for when we are asked on if we should do things for God. Now, Schultz's biggest concern was that the TV executives or the sponsors or both were going to try to edit the Bible passage out of the show. And so he very sneakily integrated the reading of the story into the plot that made it very, very difficult to edit it out. And that if they did, the story would kind of fall apart. So, very interesting. So, they completed the show 10 days before it was supposed to broadcast. 4 days before it was supposed to broadcast, they screened it to the top CBS executives. And they absolutely hated it. Their complaints were that the show was too slow-paced, that the music wasn't fitting for a children's program, that the animation was just too simple, and that they didn't want Linus reciting the story of the birth of Christ. For two reasons. One, they said audiences wouldn't want to sit through that. And number two, which I just find so ironic, they said it was too overtly religious for a Christmas special. So, since it was only 4 days before it was supposed to air, the executives had no chance to change it, to stop it from airing. They had nothing else to put in its place. So on December 9th of 1965 at 7:30, following Gilligan's Island and preempting the Munsters, Charlie Brown Christmas Special aired for the first time. It was a national ratings hit. They said 45% of people that owned a TV turned in, which was about 15.5 million people, and it finished second only to Bonanza. A month later, it would win a Peabody and an Emmy for Best Network Animated Special, and this was up against 4 different Disney specials. The soundtrack in which that everyone hated, well, I should say all the executives hated. In 2007, it was voted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2012, it was selected by the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. On November of 2021, Billboard ranked it as the #1 holiday album of all time. May of 2022, the recording industry would certify it quadruple platinum at 5 million records sold. And it is the second best-selling jazz album of all time behind Miles Davis' Kind of Blue. I'd like to ask the question, who has seen this? I hope you all have. I'm starting to get younger kids who haven't seen it, which concerns me. But as I mentioned, it's all about seeing. And there is a small little detail in this cartoon that you might have never seen before. And once I show you this detail to you, you will never not be able to see it. So Schultz gives these wonderful personalities to all the characters. And, Charlie Brown with his yellow shirt and the zigzag stripe, and Linus with his security blanket. Well, Linus holds his security blanket throughout this entire show, except for one small moment. So I want to play a small little video clip, and hopefully this works. And I want you to notice when Linus drops his blanket. When does Linus drop his blanket? Fear not. So the birth of Jesus separates us from all of our fears. This whole idea that the cartoon inspires us to seek true peace and true security in the one place it has always been and can always be found. I also find it interesting, so they did a book version of this after it became so popular, and that second panel, you probably can't see it, but it says, "Listen again," said Linus, "go outside, look up at the stars, and listen." How wonderful is that? So I should say that the show was edited. All the references to Coca-Cola were removed from the show. And yet, Linus still speaks of the birth of Christ. I just wanted to read one comment by a Pulitzer, that's easy for me to say, winning novelist and self-described Jewish liberal agnostic imperialist. That's how he describes himself, from 2009. So this is not somebody who should be interested in this. He said, "I still know that chapter and verse of the Gospel of Luke by heart, and no amount of disillusionment with the behavior of self-described Christians or with the ongoing progressive commercialization that in 1965 had already broken Charlie Brown's heart has robbed the central miracle of Christianity of its power to move me the way any true great story can." And again, the idea of, if it's not us, who will do it? So my bell is ringing. I have to get to my last artwork, and this one should go rather quickly. This one is titled Broken. This is my piece of ceramics. One of the most wonderful places in the world. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Unfortunately, I don't get there as often as I used to, but whenever I made it to the city, I always had to try to get to the Met with whatever little time I had. And one of these trips, I didn't have much time. I made it to the Met with only about a half an hour left to go. For those who've never been there before, if you really want to see the Met, it probably takes 2 or 3 days. So half an hour isn't going to do me much. And I knew exactly what I wanted to see, where it was, so I am racing through the museum trying to get to this place. And I went through one of the rooms, and it was a room filled with Asian ceramics. And I thought to myself, this is something that, it's beautiful, but it's not really what I am, all that interested in. And I'm still racing through it. All of a sudden, just like they show in the movies, this spotlight beamed down onto this artwork. Now, all of the artwork have spotlights on it, so I don't know why this particular piece stood out to me, but there it was. This was the piece. Now, my comment to you is this artwork may be the best representation of the gospel out of any of these artworks that I've shown you. Well, why is that? So this is a Japanese method of preparing broken ceramics with the most precious material that they have, and that is of gold. So the idea is that the cracks of something are part of its history, and it should be kept visible, even shiny. And that the art of embracing damage while making something whole, an object becomes more beautiful because of its flaws. And Kintsugi, they say, some suggestions about this method is the idea that we shouldn't throw anything broken away, that when an object breaks, it just means that it has no more use to it, which isn't the case. And we should try to repair things because sometimes in doing so, we attain more valuable objects, and this is the essence of resilience. And every object breaks a little bit differently, so there's no one object that looks the same. Well then, how does this represent the gospel? Well, first of all, the idea that there are 61 references in the Bible that talk about clay, and there's 23 that talk about the potter. And just a few, Isaiah 64:8, "O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter, and all of us are the work of your hand." Psalm 139, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." So we are all the perfect artwork of the great potter. Unfortunately, we are also all broken. We are born into a sinful world, and we are broken because of that sin. But God used the most precious of materials to make us whole again. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Jesus was broken so that we could be made whole again. And the most precious of materials is Christ's blood that holds us all together and makes us whole again. So we are now starting a new year, a year that seems filled with anxiety, stress, wars, inflation, violence, a presidential election. And I just want everyone to remember that the King still has another move. And for someone who doesn't know who God is, if they picked up the Bible and started reading the Bible, the very, very first thing that they would learn about God is what? He's an artist. In the beginning, God created. In fact, we even have the first art critique. It was good. And by the time they get to the end of the book, they will learn that, well, the King wins. Thank you. I was just going to say, I thought somebody was coming.
Thank you, Alan, for showing us so many connections and ways that we can look for and find God in art. We appreciate your expertise and creative insights, as well as your time with us this evening. Our February speaker will be Father Richard Shepka, who will speak on the way of the heart on Monday, February 12th at 7 p.m. There are flyers available at the entrances of the church with information about our January 20th Polish dinner and our two-night Lenten mission in March. Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you to our Taste and See Committee for providing light refreshments, to our live stream team, and to our Holy Name Society, who sponsored the presentation this evening. There are free will offering baskets at the entrances. Please join us for refreshments in the back of the church. Have a good evening.